why do people attack the West, and why within the West does there seem to be a sort of imp of the perverse that wants to destroy everything that gave us what we have.
There are such things as British values, there are such things as Western values. We've got to be confident in what they are, and that is the only way that we will continue to thrive as a society and as a civilization.
We in the West, we live right now in the most prosperous, most secure, most free countries the world has ever seen. And that didn't happen by accident.
The West is under attack. We live in the freest, healthiest and wealthiest societies in human history. Yet as authoritarian and oppressive regimes threaten us from without, a new movement within tells us to feel nothing but shame for who we are.
If the truth is that we are systemically racist and that all our recent past, or most of it, is a past of racism and exploitation, then who on earth would want to maintain faith in us? It's really a recipe for revolution from the ground up. And my reading of history is that revolutions from the ground up are rarely successful and usually disastrous.
Freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, the liberties that we all enjoy, and so much more than that. Our cultural and cognitive and intellectual achievements, all of those things are very, very fragile, and if they are lost, there's no guarantee that they will be re-achieved.
Most of the people who are going at the West have been deeply shaped and influenced by it. Many of them are themselves more Western than they're willing to acknowledge.
Welcome to the West. This is my take on the great and still unfolding adventure of who we are and why it matters. This is a history of how our extraordinary, unconventional civilization came to be and why it must be defended. It's a fascinating and often unexpected journey, stretching back 15 centuries to the fall of Rome. And it starts with a mystery, the loss of Western self-confidence. What on earth happened to the West?
I've often wondered about the shyness of some of us in the West about standing for these ideals that have done so much to ease the plight of man and the hardships of our imperfect world.
I was raised on the idea that the West mattered, that its values were admirable, its achievements extraordinary. But today it has become fashionable to attack the West, to claim the West's achievements are commonplace, while its crimes are unique, that the freest, most open, healthiest and wealthiest societies in human history are pits of systemic oppression. Instead of defending our heritage, we are told, the great task of our time is to tear everything down. In the 1980s, President Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher used the West as a rallying cry to help our free societies find the moral courage to stand firm against Soviet communism. But something has changed.
20 years ago we thought the Cold War was over and that the liberal West was secure, and to quote Francis Fukuyama's ill-fated remark about the end of history, capital E, the end. Sadly, that's no longer the case, and we now have to be careful to defend what we have in the West.
So the silver lining of the Cold War was that we knew what we didn't want. It was very clear that we didn't want to be like the Soviet Union. We didn't want to be like Romania. We certainly didn't want to be like Albania or the Cultural Revolution in China. We didn't want any of those things. So we knew what we didn't want, and it strengthened the idea of the West because we could see the opposite. We could see how our values were destroyed and how we really wouldn't want that. And that was, in a way, the value of it. And the danger now that we do not have a Cold War, although we arguably have some substitutes for it, the danger now is that we cease to understand or value what it is good about the West.
Well, the great controversy that kicked off America's culture war, in a sense, was the battle over Stanford's required course in Western civilization. This was actually the most popular course at Stanford, and it was attacked in 1987, 1988 by the forces of multiculturalism, what we would now call the woke. And at first, they didn't make much headway because this was, in fact, the most popular course. Students loved it, students defended it. But as the battle played out, the forces of multiculturalism started hurling accusations of racism. And so at that point, the balance shifted, and the course in Western civilization was eliminated, at least as a requirement, and a multicultural course was put in its place. So as people have ceased to study the West, we have lost the understanding of the importance of, say, free speech. Free speech is really something without which Western liberal democracy cannot exist. And free speech is under attack at the very same moment that we have ceased to study and appreciate the West. Is this a coincidence? No, not at all.
What we do know is that it's not very hard to have entire civilizations and cultures lose their sense of who they are if they lose their sense of their roots and their history. Once you lose that sense, which can happen very quickly, I think in many respects you end up with a civilization and a culture that has no moorings.
In 1997, Margaret Thatcher told an American audience that it is time to proclaim our beliefs in the wonderful creativity of the human spirit, in the rights of property and the rule of law, in the extraordinary fecundity of enterprise and trade, and in the Western cultural heritage, without which our liberty would long ago have degenerated into license or collapsed into tyranny. These are as much the tasks of today as they were of yesterday. This series is my attempt to live up to that challenge. Over 6 episodes, we're going to revisit the West's extraordinary history to understand where it comes from, what makes it so different, why it is worth standing up for.
To me, the West it certainly means liberal politics. What does that mean? That means a political organization where the rights and freedoms of individuals are secured by law, where the power of the executive is constrained by law.
Jerusalem taught the West that life is going somewhere. The human story has a beginning and it has a destination. The ancient Greeks, beginning with the pre-Socratics in the 5th century BC, taught the West that there are deep truths built into the world and into us, and that we can know these truths by reason. This is the foundation, for example, of all science. It's why what we know is the scientific method. And Rome taught the West that the rule of law is superior to the rule of brute force or coercion in ordering the human community.
Traditional Western narratives begin with the ancient cultures of Greece, Israel, and Rome. All three are indeed vital influences on the West. But the history of the West itself really begins some 9 centuries after the heyday of ancient Athens, with the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire. That's where our story begins, not with a high point of civilization, but among the primitive barbarian tribes vying for power in the ruins of Roman rule. The barbarians are often demonized, but as we'll see, they have a key role to play in the story of the West. The next episode will tackle the importance of Christianity, which infused barbarian culture with its own revolutionary ethic of human dignity. The third episode investigates the rule of law and the West's achievement in setting it above even kings and emperors. In episode 4, we turn to the West's inventive and commercial spirit and the scientific and medical advances that followed. In episode 5, we reach the age of discovery and also identify the real source of the West's astonishing wealth. Finally, in episode 6, we will turn to the West's future, its enduring strength and importance.
Through all of this, we'll be grappling with a question that has become hard to ask, but is perhaps the most pressing of our time. what is the West? And why is it so vital for us to defend it? It was late in the day, on the 15th of October, 1764, when the young Edward Gibbon, only 27 years old, stood here in Rome, in the ruins of the ancient Forum. The sun was setting, and as he admired the classical remains all around him, the hypnotic cadences of Gregorian chant drifted across the field of broken columns. The music came from what was left of the great temple to Jupiter, where now our brotherhood of monks, barefoot, in plain woolen habits, was singing the evening prayer. Suddenly, Gibbon was inspired. He would write a history book to answer the mystery of how classical Rome declined and fell, how the mighty empire ended up as shattered marble, overrun by barbarians and a curious Eastern faith obsessed by theological minutiae. But I'm here to investigate a different mystery, what came next. For all our debts to the classical world and the Jewish tradition, this is where the story of the West really begins, in the ruins of Rome's Western Empire. As Gibbon understood, what emerged in the lands of Western Europe was the most unlikely fusion of barbarian tribes and the universal claims of Catholic Christianity. He called it the triumph of barbarism and religion. Gibbon preferred the grandeur of Rome, and why not? Its successor was a sort of rough-tempered mongrel, riven by war, never able to cohere into a single empire again. For centuries, the West would have been easy to dismiss as small, poor, and backward. Many did. Yet the barbarous West expanded from the ruins of Rome to global dominance. It created and retreated from worldwide empires of its own, as well as establishing vast settler nations in the Americas and the Antipodes. Despite the growth of new competitors, as Western innovations like science, industrialization, and modern capitalism are taken up around the world, the West remains preeminent. How did we get here? The West's enemies argue that the answer is obvious: exploitation and plunder. An answer too pat and simple to be true.
I think the idea that the West is fundamentally based on plunder and slavery and colonialism and all of these evils, I think is frankly reductionist nonsense.
It's incontestable to anybody who seriously looks at the figures that life was far better by the end of the 19th century, and industrialization and agricultural revolution transformed for the better the lives of millions of people.
The claim is often made that the West is rich because of its exploitation of resources and people elsewhere in the world. But the consensus among economic historians of British colonialism and among historians of slavery is that this thesis has been widely discredited. And I'm there quoting David Bryan Davis.
Our culture was built off of the backs of the working classes, the people who were down the mines fueling the Industrial Revolution. It is built on the backs of the Normans, the Anglo-Saxons. You know, there's so much richness in our history.
But to say that the wealth and prosperity of industrial and post-industrial Britain was built on slavery is false.
So what did underpin the rise of the West? Geography imposes some limits and provides some luck. Eurasia was always likely to be the home of great civilizations. Our corner of Europe was to some extent protected from Eastern invaders and well connected by rivers and coastal navigation. But the success of civilizations elsewhere, especially in China, suggests this can't be the whole answer. There's a sordid history in which some thinkers, especially in the 19th century, tried to tie Western success to racial exceptionalism, but with no basis. in reality.
But that kind of biological racism, the idea that white people are naturally, biologically, genetically, whatever you want to call it, superior to non-white peoples, that was a late 19th century development, and I take it never dominated Western thinking generally, because it always vied with the Enlightenment and Christian view that all human beings are basically equal regardless of race.
Even some of our society's most radical critics understood the West as a shared inheritance, one that defies artificial racial barriers. The Marxist historian C.L.R. James was born in the Crown Colony of Trinidad, but he knew where his true roots lay. I set out to master the literature, philosophy, and ideas of Western civilization. That is where I have come from, and I would not pretend to be anything else. The African-American scholar and civil rights pioneer W.E.B. Du Bois also defiantly claimed his kinship with the Western greats. I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not. Across the colour line I move, arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas. From out of the caves of evening that swing between strong-limbed earth and the tracery of the stars, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul I will, and they come all graciously, with no scorn nor condescension.
I think the idea that the West is inherently racist and naturally exclusive and excludes people from other countries, from other ethnicities, is demonstrably false. This idea that classical music, for example, is Eurocentric by nature, that people can't participate in the culture of this country just because they are from a particular place, I think actually is in the spirit of the old racism that Martin Luther King actually fought against, because these are not just the achievements of Western civilization, they are the achievements of all of humanity, and all of humanity have the, everybody has the ability to appreciate and love and identify with Shakespeare, the characters in Shakespeare, the universal human narratives, the things that make Shakespeare such great art.
I'm a man of the West. I'm an inheritor of its great traditions. I have said this many times and I'll say it here. Tolstoy is mine. Dickens is mine. Newton, Maxwell, and Einstein are mine.
Exploitation and plunder isn't what makes the West stand out either. That happened everywhere. The pyramids are magnificent, so is the Taj Mahal, but they stand for a world of domination in which a privileged few snatched the output of the many and left everyone else in poverty. The West was different. And perhaps the best answer is to say that the West isn't a normal civilization at all.
When Hernan Cortés and his men entered the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in November 1519, they were astonished. It was, Cortés wrote in a letter to King Charles V, the most beautiful object in the world.
Tenochtitlan was certainly one of the world's largest cities. In 1500 of the world's 10 largest cities, only one was in Europe. The biggest was probably Beijing. Paris made the top 10, but with a population less than 2/3 the size of Tenochtitlan, London was 4 times smaller again. And yet by the early 1500s, the West was already an extraordinarily dynamic culture. As the arrival of the Spanish in the New World demonstrated, they rode in on a mix of technological innovation, religious conviction, and individual ambition. And it wasn't just in Spain. Pocket-sized city republics like Florence here had given birth to the Italian Renaissance, just as the tiny democracy of ancient Athens had made outsized contributions to philosophy and art that its giant conqueror, the Roman Empire, could only envy.
Masaccio's fresco of the Trinity, one of the first great works of the Renaissance to use the new invention of linear perspective, was painted in the 1420s. Ghiberti's Doors of Paradise for the Florence Baptistry, again employing the new discovery of perspective, were completed in 1452. the magnificent dome of the cathedral here, had been finished and topped with its bronze cross in 1469. And Michelangelo's David was unveiled in this square in September 1504. And you can see in his eyes something of what made the West so different. This was a new kind of hero. Unlike the classical models it drew on, here was an individual with an immortal soul and a conscience who lived in biblical time. History was headed somewhere, and in the service of that divine plan, even the smallest, like David, might become kings, while giants fell before them.
Individuals in the West typically consult their own goals first. So they orient to their own inner world about what they would like to achieve and also what they view as right and wrong in the outside world. And that is what motivates their actions. The actions are an attempt to live out in the world the convictions that they first of all have inwardly in themselves. It's in that sense that life is lived from the inside out. And that is exceptional. That is not true of most of the world. Most of the world lives life from the outside in. That is, they take their cues about what to do from what various authority figures tell them to do. And the focus is on the external pressures that they have to adjust to rather than on their own goals.
The Western mindset marks a radical break. The West's triumph is the triumph of the small, of the individual unleashed. Civilization's natural tendency is always to fall back into the same trap, denying individual agency and favoring central power. The result is splendid monuments, but mortared with blood, like the pyramids at the heart of the great city of Tenochtitlan, built for mass human sacrifice.
In the West, we finally escaped this trap by sheer luck. In the 5th century, Rome fell and never came back. And although historians like Gibbon have been sentimental for its glories, we can look back now and recognize in Rome all the horrors that characterize the eternal trap of civilization.
Christians lived a more decent, humane way of life than was available elsewhere in the Roman Empire at the time. I mean, everybody's seen the movie Gladiator probably a dozen times. You can't avoid it. That's not 500 BC. That's 150 AD. We remember the movie begins with Marcus Aurelius, who's emperor in the mid-2nd century. And it's a dreadful environment where even the noblest and most powerful of men, like the hero, Maximus, is completely at the whim of forces beyond his control.
What we got instead was something unprecedented. Instead of a single empire, the West became a great patchwork of competing authorities and nations.
Here there was no final no that could be said, and a new culture rose up, shaped by the barbarians who took over the western half of Rome's empire when it fell. Here, for the first time, was somewhere power could never be simply hoarded by the few, making possible instead the liberation of the many. The barbarian tribes have names that are still bywords for violent destruction, Visigoths and Vandals. But there was another side, and out of that rough soil grew something astonishing. A whole new post-Roman culture emerged. It eventually had its own splendid architectural style, mockingly dubbed Gothic by classically minded snobs, and a distinctive culture of liberty under law. Both are still visible in the Mother of Parliaments in Westminster. This is a radically different vision of civilization to that which emerged elsewhere. Perhaps Winston Churchill expressed it best in a speech he gave in 1938.
There are few words which are used more loosely than the word civilization. What does it mean? It means a society based upon the opinion of civilians. It means that violence, the rule of warriors and despotic chiefs, the conditions of camps and warfare, of riot and tyranny, give place to parliaments where laws are made, and independent courts of justice in which over long periods those laws are maintained. That is civilization, and in its soil grow continually freedom, comfort, and culture. When civilization reigns in any country, a wider and less harassed life is afforded to the masses of the people. The traditions of the past are cherished, and the inheritance bequeathed to us by former wise or valiant men becomes a rich estate to be enjoyed and used by all.
That Western ideal of civilization, so strange in historical perspective, with its emphasis on popular consent, freedom, and the rule of law, began with the people who took over from Rome, a society of independent-minded warriors who, by all previous standards, seemed anything but civilized, the barbarians.
So I think the Germanic tribes start something fundamental, and they are really the origins of Western culture. It isn't, in general, a superior culture. I don't say that. I don't believe that. Western culture is a culture of mastery. It's about basically controlling the outside world in order to pursue one's own goals. That's what the West is all about. And it's that temperament that allowed it to generate the wealth and power that we find in British history and then in American history, and European history also.
What were the barbarians like? Well, above all, brave. That word descends from a contraction of the Latin word for them, barbarous. They were very uncivilized, not just in culture, but in the sense that they were not city people. Over time, they coalesced into larger groups, but they were born from small political units, led by warrior councils or by kings, and they retained an unusually egalitarian culture. A king's right to rule depended on his merit as a warrior, and there was also an ideal of aristocratic equality among the great warriors who were the king's companions. But it went far wider. Among the Goths, one of the largest barbarian tribes, anywhere from a fifth to half the population had the status of free men. An old Catalonian legend tells of the oath sworn by Catalan nobles to their king. We, who are as good as you, swear to accept you as our king, provided you observe all our liberties and laws. But if not, not.
These tribes came in from the east and they settled all of what is now Western Europe, and their own style was assertive and fractious and competitive. And they honored leaders who were accountable to others, but at the same time took initiative. So there's a dynamism in the society that comes from somewhere, I don't know where. And that is then transformed in the rest of European history into the culture we see today, which is still a culture of individual initiative and turmoil and change, but moderated and controlled by also the moralism of the culture, which sets limits on how much you can do and doesn't allow runaway chaos and runaway disorder. You don't have that.
Queen Boadicea was from an earlier age, but she too shared much of the barbarians' spirits as a Celt. Churchill observed that this monument reminds us of a cry that has echoed down throughout Western history: liberty or death.
Freedom is one of those words that appears right at the beginning of the Western tradition. We see this, for example, in the Hebrew Bible. We see this in the Greek thought. We see this to a certain extent in Roman law as well. But it's very clear that freedom is seen as something that's distinctly characteristic of those who are people of the West.
In 1613, William Shakespeare's company, The King's Men, performed a new play by John Fletcher, which told the story of Boadicea's rebellion. In the final act, rather than be captured and enslaved, Boadicea commits suicide, declaiming, "If you will keep your laws and empire whole, place in your Roman flesh a Briton soul."
That is not a bad statement of the West's mongrel nature. We have barbarian souls willing to fight for ideals of liberty and personal dignity rather than accept the stability and monumental grandeur of belonging to a conventional civilization.
Again, the core idea of the Western tradition centers around certain principles, chief among which are individual liberty, religious freedom, economic freedom, constitutionalism, rule of law. All of these pivot around the individual. In the end, the individual is at the core of what the West is about. Not that we don't have religious affiliations, ethnic affiliations, etc., But in the public sphere, first and foremost, we're individuals.
But there's two distinctive things about it that I think are also very characteristic of the West. One is that freedom is linked to reason. That when we use our will, when we make choices, we're not just making them by following our passions. We're using our reason to think about what is a good choice and a bad choice. And that's the other connection, the second connection, that freedom in the West is intimately bound up with questions of good and evil. That we become truly free when we choose the good, and when we choose evil, we become, in a sense, a slave of our passions. We become something that we're not supposed to be. So freedom in the West, yes, it does mean free choice, it means free will, but ultimately it's about acquiring mastery over ourselves, so that we become truly free when we freely choose to live in the truth that's revealed to us by reason, and if you're a believer, by faith as well.
Trafalgar Square is a very Western kind of monument. It records a key battle for the defence of our way of life against a dictator. And in a nice historical coincidence, the place name Trafalgar is actually an anglicised version of Taf al-Ghab, Arabic for the end of the West. Elevated at its centre is not an emperor, pharaoh, or a god-king, but a free individual, a man of the West. Some 13 centuries after the birth of the West in the ruins of Rome, our barbarian heritage is still recognisable in the open and individualistic culture that produced Nelson, and in his military daring and strategic genius.
And it's no surprise that Fletcher's play about Boadicea continued to speak to the British heart, almost 200 years after it was first performed. Back in 1695, the composer Henry Purcell had set it to music. One tune in particular, Britons Strike Home, became a popular patriotic song. And at the Battle of Trafalgar, it was played from the deck of HMS Tonnant, until 2 bandsmen were killed by enemy fire. The very same ship, incidentally, later helped inspire the Star-Spangled Banner. Francis Scott Key dined aboard the Tonnant before the Battle of Baltimore and overheard the British plan of attack, so he was held captive and had a ringside view of the rocket's red glare.
Thanks to the barbarian invasions, the West took a unique route. You might call it the long road to civilization. Politically divided, with small cities and distributed authority. There was no one who could exploit and enslave the population as a whole to create a civilization as superficially grand as flourished elsewhere.
The rough, barbarous world of what contemptuous outsiders often lumped together as the Franks didn't look sophisticated, but it had an extraordinary energy because it took individuals seriously and cared about liberty. It was innovative, willing to get its hands dirty, and not afraid to challenge old ways of doing things.
But the barbarian West could have remained nothing more than a primitive land riven with bloody ambition. It would never have become so great without its guide in the darkness, a faith from the East that had already taken over the Roman Empire and so also carried the cultural inheritance of the classical world.
I think the encounter with those of my ancestors, usually called the barbarians, my people are from north of the Alps, it may have accelerated Christianity's embrace of a more mobile, even democratic way of ordering public life. These guys were certainly not Democrats as we would understand the term, but there was some more sense of popular participation in running the tribe and so forth. What was even more important was the Christianizing of the barbarians.
What's now known as the Franks casket was carved from whalebone in the 8th century, somewhere in Northumbria. It's an incredible medley of influence, just like the West itself, There are Anglo-Saxon runes framing images from both Roman history and barbarian legend. We get the founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus, Wayland the Smith, a barbarian hero. But at the centre is a Christian story, the adoration of the Magi, bringing their gifts to celebrate the birth of Jesus. Seek not in courts nor palaces, nor royal curtains draw, but search the stable, see your God, extended on the straw.
I think Christianity has shaped us in ways that we fail to even recognise, because, as with freedom, it's something that we have always had and therefore completely take for granted and then are discarding at our peril.
It's not just freedom, it's not just the worship of freedom, it is freedom with a purpose and a sense of virtue. That sense of virtue, whether you like it or not, whether you subscribe to it or not, has completely shaped everything we think and feel.
Like the barbarians, Christianity understood the value of the individual, but in a whole new way. Its apostles were social outcasts and labourers. Its God was born in a stable and worked as a carpenter. In the unique environment of the West, Christian beliefs helped to create a culture of learning and devotion and respect for the poor and oppressed that would transform the world, turning the gaze of the West towards the rising sun in the East.